Can you compare the special features of different kinds of converters / filling mechanisms? By special features, I mean things other than ink capacity. For example, a twisted converter has the ability to manually force ink into the feed when the pen writes dry. A push converter is easy for cleaning, but you cannot see the ink level, etc. Any additional thoughts about this? Okay, so you kind of open it up to all filling mechanisms as I'm reading your question again now. When I read it the first time, I pretty much only saw the converter part, so that's literally all I prepped for. So I'm just only going to talk about the converter. So forgive me, Poe, if I don't cover all filling mechanisms. I'm only going to talk about converters because even that, there's a good amount to talk about. So when it comes to converters, there's basically about 4 different types. Now, there might be some other kind of weird ones I'm not sure of, but the ones that I have available to me anyway, there's 4 different types. The main one is the piston type. That's what you see on most fountain pens. There's a Pilot Con 50. It's got a little agitator in there. Most of them don't have that, but you may notice it. It's just got a little piston inside, and as you twist it, piston moves up and down. Okay, very simple concept. It's what you see with standard international pens. It's what you see with Lamy. It's what you see with most Pilot pens. It's very kind of like the common, more universal converter. If you had to say just, hey, I need a converter, this is what you're going to more think of. Now there's some other options, and not quite as many. You mentioned a push one in here. There's not a lot of those. Parker has one. I don't even sell that one because it's just not as sturdy of a converter as the twist one. But the other one that I do have is the Monteverde Mini converter, which is a tiny little thing. It's a little push converter. Also not built super sturdy, but that one's shorter than most, so that's where it can come in handy. And that's a standard international size on the end of it, so you can use that one on any standard international pen that accepts a converter. But the ink capacity is smaller, so it's really, as far as that Monteverde Mini one goes, it's really only good for if you have pens that only would fit that size converter, that are too short to fit a full-size converter. The other type that you have, which I think is what you're talking about when you say a push converter, is something like the Pilot Con 20, or like what comes on the Pilot Metropolitan, which is a variation but very similar. So this is an aerometric converter. It's got an ink bladder inside of there. You squeeze the bladder and you let it go. That's how this thing works. So the disadvantage of this one is you can't see in there. It's a higher ink capacity than the twist converter, but you can't see as much inside of there. So that's kind of the main disadvantage. And if you need to kind of prime ink to go down through the feed, you can do that with this type of converter, but it's a lot harder, it's a lot messier. It's not nice as the twist one, where you can just kind of like force a little bit of ink down, especially for those of you who like to take and fill your converters directly with an ink syringe. Yeah, you can do that. It's totally legit. I got an ink syringe right here. So you can like fill directly in there, and then your pen doesn't get all messy on the end and all that kind of stuff. But the problem is when you do that, then your feed is not primed because you're not sucking ink up through the pen, through the bottle as you're filling it. So once you have that, then you need to force a little bit of ink down through your converter. Technically, it's a lower ink capacity because you're not also filling your feed with ink when you fill the pen and so on. But anyway, that's what you're dealing with there. There's one other type that I have, which is, I don't even know technically what this is, if it's a vacuum or what do you call it, a button or whatever. I consider it a vacuum because that's technically how it draws. But the Pilot Con 70, now this is kind of a unique converter. It only fits a few Pilot pens, but it's got a button that you push on the back here, and it causes this little rubber stopper to block here, and then it creates pressure inside here, and then when you let it go, it sucks up in there. So it's kind of a vacuum, it's a variation of a vacuum filler, not something like the TWSBI Vac 700, which I'm going to actually talk about in the next question, but that gives you an idea there. And the Con 70, the pro of that one is it's a higher ink capacity. The con is it doesn't fit all pens, and it's kind of a pain to clean out because ink gets all up inside the top here where the rod goes in, and it gets really messy. So it's to change colors with that converter is a little more of a pain, and it's not as great for cleaning out a pen. I always use a bulb syringe to clean out my converter pens anyway, so that's definitely a handy tool when you're doing that. So all of this to talk about to say, basically you don't, we can talk about all these things, but unless it's going to influence your pen purchasing decision, you really aren't often getting a choice about the converter that you get, with the exception of Pilot, which has kind of one of each of these varieties. So for example, if you're using a larger Pilot pen like a Metal Falcon or a Justice 95 or a Custom 74 that fits the Con 70 converter, you can use any of these Pilot converters with that pen, those pens. But most other fountain pens, like a Lamy, for example, it fits a Z24, that's it. It might fit a Z26, but it's basically the same thing. Doesn't buy you anything to switch converters there. but there's really not a choice. There's no aerometric converter for a Lamy, you know what I mean? So it's like you really often aren't getting a choice. So that's kind of where it comes down to. And now that I'm originally reading your question again, talking about other filling mechanisms, we could broaden it a little bit. You know, a piston filling pen, you know, has a larger ink capacity than pretty much all cartridge converter pens. The disadvantage is it's a little bit harder to clean out because you can't just use a bulb syringe. You got to flush and flush and flush and flush. So if you change colors a lot, a piston's a little more of a pain. However, the larger ink capacity, the idea is you don't have to change colors as often, or you don't have to refill as often. So generally you use piston pens with inks that you're using more constantly. Same thing kind of goes for a vacuum filler. It's got an even larger ink capacity. The main advantage of a vacuum filler is that it has a rubber stopper in here. So this is with the Twizy Vac 700, the Pilot Custom 823, maybe some other pens. I think Visconti's got a vacuum filler. Never seen it, but I'm pretty sure they have one. And there might be some others out there. Parker's got some older ones. So it's got a little rubber stopper in here that actually blocks off the ink chamber. So if you're flying with the pen or traveling with it or anything like that, your ink chamber is completely sealed. You're not going to have ink leakage like you might with some other larger bodied pens. The disadvantage would be you have to unscrew the cap and pull up on it a little bit to open up that ink chamber when you're writing. Otherwise, you're only going to have the ink that's in your feed and it's going to dry up after a little bit. So it's kind of a pain to have to do that constantly. So if you're taking quick little notes here and there, it might be more of a pain to do it with a vac filler as opposed to something like a piston or a cartridge converter. And then you have eyedropper pens as well, which is essentially a cartridge converter that you pulled the cartridge converter out, silicone grease the threads, and you fill the whole body with ink. You can't do that with all pens. You have to do it only with specific ones that don't have metal parts on the inside and that are all sealed up and don't have holes in them or anything like that. But those ones, you get a higher ink capacity. That's your main advantage, and it's kind of cool to see the ink sloshing around inside there. The main disadvantage is you have more of a likelihood of leaking and burping and stuff like that because of the higher ink capacity. It's not necessarily the ink that causes it, but it's when the ink level gets low that your air that's inside of that large cavity heats up and then pushes ink throughout, heats up through the heat of your hand. So that covers most of them. You got other ones like lever fillers and crescent fillers and stuff like that that are much less common, more common with vintage. You know, I won't really cover those too much because those are all kind of variations of bladder fillers anyway. So that pretty much covers most of them, and I'm going to move on.